The rain had been relentless since dawn, turning the country roads into muddy trails. Jacob, a hard-working farmer in his late 50s, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he loaded the last bundle of hay onto his old pickup truck. His farm, nestled in the quiet countryside, was his pride and legacy, a place built with years of labor, sacrifice, and love. Life hadn't been easy, but he never complained. He believed in kindness, in lending a hand when someone needed it, just as his father had taught him. As he stepped back to admire his work, the distant sound of an engine struggling to start caught his attention. He turned toward the narrow road leading past his property and squinted through the downpour. A sleek black car, the kind he had only seen in magazines, was stranded on the roadside. The hood was slightly open, and beside it stood a man in his 40s, dressed in a drenched business suit, his hands resting on his hips in frustration. Jacob hesitated for only a second before grabbing his toolbox from the truck. City folks rarely pass through this area, and when they did, they weren't used to the unpredictable countryside roads. As he approached, the stranger looked up, relief flashing across his weary face. "Car trouble?" Jacob asked, his voice calm and steady despite the rain. "Yeah," the man sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. "Engine just died on me. No service out here either." Jacob nodded, already examining the vehicle. "These fancy cars," he murmured, tapping the hood. "They sure do look nice, but they don't handle country roads too well." The stranger let out a short laugh, though frustration was still clear in his eyes. "You're probably right. Guess I should have checked the route before driving out here." Jacob didn't ask why a man like him, clearly someone from the city, was in the middle of nowhere. He focused on the engine, hands moving with the skill of someone who had fixed more machines than he could count. The rain soaked through his flannel shirt, but he didn't mind. Helping was second nature to him. "I appreciate this," the man said after a moment, watching Jacob work. "I don't even know how I'd get a tow truck out here." Jacob chuckled. "You'd be waiting till next week." He paused and looked up. "Name's Jacob, by the way." The man hesitated before offering a firm handshake. "Daniel," he replied. "Daniel Carter." Jacob didn't react. He had no idea that Daniel Carter was one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country, a billionaire, a name that echoed through boardrooms and financial news headlines, a man who built empires from nothing. Out here in the middle of a storm, he was just another traveler in need of help. Jacob wiped his hands on a rag and turned back to the engine. "Well, Daniel, let's see if we can get you back on the road." As he worked, Daniel studied the farmer. There was something about Jacob, an ease, a quiet strength, that he rarely saw in the fast-paced world of business. The kind of man who valued hard work, not wealth, a life so different from his own. "So, you run this farm all by yourself?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Jacob shook his head. "My son used to help, but he moved to the city. My wife, she passed a few years back." His voice softened at the last part, but he didn't dwell on it. "It's just me now." Daniel frowned slightly. He didn't know what it was like to lose a wife, but he knew loneliness, the kind that even money couldn't fix. A few minutes passed in silence, the sound of rain filling the air. Then, with a final twist of his wrench, Jacob stepped back. "Try it now." Daniel slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. A grin spread across Jacob's face. "There you go." Daniel let out a relieved laugh and stepped out of the car. "You're a lifesaver, Jacob." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash. "Here, take this, for your trouble." Jacob's smile faded as he glanced at the money. He wiped his hands again, this time more slowly, then shook. his head. "I didn't help you for money, son." Daniel blinked. "It's just a thank you." Jacob patted the side of the car. "You want to thank me? Drive safe. Don't get stuck in the mud again." For the first time in a long while, Daniel found himself at a loss for words. He had met countless people, businessmen, investors, competitors, all driven by money. But here was a man who fixed his car in the pouring rain and wouldn't take a dime for it. The rain was letting up, but Daniel didn't start the car just yet. Instead, he looked at Jacob with new curiosity. "You ever thought about expanding your farm? Hiring more people? Upgrading equipment?" Jacob let out a low chuckle. "Takes money for all that, and I'm not exactly rolling in it." Daniel leaned against the car, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What if I told you I could help?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Help how?" Daniel paused, debating how much to say. He wasn't sure why, but something about this farmer, this place, made him want to do something more than just drive away. He had built his career on investments, taking chances. Maybe, just maybe, he had stumbled onto something more valuable than money, a man who reminded him of the things wealth could never buy. But before Daniel could respond, the sound of another car approaching interrupted the moment. Both men turned to see a black SUV pulling up beside them. The driver rolled down the window. "Sir, we've been looking everywhere for you." Jacob watched as Daniel's expression shifted. The relaxed, grateful man from a moment ago was gone. In his place stood someone sharper, more calculated, the kind of man who was used to being in control. Jacob frowned slightly. "Who exactly are you, Daniel?" Daniel hesitated. He could brush it off, give a vague answer, thank Jacob one last time, and leave. Or he could tell him the truth. The SUV idled, waiting. The rain had stopped. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter found himself standing at a crossroads he never expected. What he said next would change both their lives forever. This leaves the story on an engaging cliffhanger, making the audience eager for the next part. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Jacob studied Daniel's face, his instincts telling him there was more to this man than he let on. The way the driver of the SUV addressed him, the way his whole demeanor shifted. Jacob had seen this before. City people, businessmen, folks with too much money and not enough time. But there was something different about Daniel. He wasn't just another traveler passing through. Daniel exhaled, glancing back at the SUV before turning to Jacob. I run a company," he admitted. "A big one." Jacob raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Is that so?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, Carter Industries. Maybe you've heard of it." Jacob thought for a moment. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he didn't follow business news or keep up with city affairs. His world was crops, animals, and long hours under the sun. "Can't say I have," he replied honestly. Daniel shook his head, more amused than offended. "Well, let's just say I'm usually on the other side of things. I don't fix cars. I pay people to fix them. I don't get lost in the middle of nowhere. I have assistants who handle my schedule." But today, all that didn't matter. He met Jacob's gaze. "Today, I was just a guy whose car broke down, and you helped me, without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return." Jacob shrugged. "That's just how things should be, son. You see someone in trouble. You help 'em." Daniel studied him for a long moment. The simplicity of his words carried a weight Daniel wasn't used to. In his world, everything had a price. Deals, partnerships, even friendships. There was always an angle, always an expectation. But Jacob had no angle. Just a man with worn hands, a muddy truck, and an honest heart. The driver in the SUV cleared his throat impatiently. "Sir, we should go. You have meetings lined up back in the city." Daniel hesitated. He was supposed to leave. Go back to his life, his world. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to. He looked at Jacob's farm, the weathered barn, the fenced pastures, the land stretching beyond the horizon. It was a place of hard work, of struggle, but also of something Daniel hadn't felt in years. Peace. "Jacob," he said slowly, "what if I told you I wanted to invest in your farm?" Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Invest," Daniel nodded. "Not charity. A real investment. Expand your farm. Get better equipment. Hire more hands. You work hard. You deserve more than just scraping by." Jacob studied him carefully. "And what do you get out of it?" Daniel hesitated. That was the part he wasn't sure about. His whole life had been about gains and returns. But this wasn't about profit. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But something tells me this place is worth more than just money." Jacob let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. City folks and their ideas. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You don't know anything about farming, do you?" Daniel grinned. "Not a thing." Jacob smirked. "Then maybe you ought to spend a day here before making big offers." Daniel paused. The idea was ridiculous. He had a full schedule waiting for him. Investors who needed updates. Employees who expected decisions. But none of it seemed as important as the simple challenge in Jacob's eyes. He turned to his driver. "Cancel my meetings." The driver blinked. "Sir?" Daniel glanced back at Jacob's farm, a strange excitement bubbling in his chest. "I'm staying." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." And just like that, Daniel Carter, the billionaire entrepreneur, stepped into a world completely different from his own. The morning air was crisp, the scent of damp earth filling Daniel's lungs. As he followed Jacob into the barn, the place was old but sturdy, filled with the sounds of animals stirring. A few cows glanced at him curiously, and a hen flapped its wings as he stepped too close. Daniel wrinkled his nose. "You get used to the smell," Jacob said with a grin. Daniel wasn't so sure. He had spent his life in boardrooms, in luxury offices, in pristine suits. Here, everything was raw, unpolished, but also real. Jacob handed him a pitchfork. "You ever cleaned a stall before?" Daniel took the pitchfork hesitantly. "Can't say I have." "Well," Jacob said, clapping him on the back, "there's a first time for everything." And so Daniel Carter, the billionaire, spent the next 2 hours shoveling hay, cleaning stalls, and doing the kind of work he had never imagined himself doing. His expensive shoes were ruined. His shirt was covered in dirt, and his back ached in ways he wasn't used to. But with every task, he felt something shift inside him. Jacob watched him struggle, but said nothing. The city man had heart. He'd give him that. By noon, Daniel was exhausted. He collapsed onto a bale of hay, wiping sweat from his forehead. "How do you do this every day?" Jacob chuckled. "You get used to it." Daniel let out a breath, looking around. "It's hard work, but it's honest work." Jacob nodded. "That it is." Daniel was silent for a moment, then looked at Jacob seriously. "I meant what I said about investing." Jacob sighed, sitting beside him. "It's not just about money, Daniel. Farming ain't like business. You can't control everything. Some years are good, some years are bad. You learn to live with it." Daniel frowned. He wasn't used to uncertainty. He was used to numbers, strategies, control. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe he had spent so long trying to control everything that he had forgotten how to just live. Before he could say anything, The sound of a truck approaching caught their attention. A red pickup pulled up near the barn, and a man stepped out, a tall, lean figure with sharp eyes. Jacob's expression darkened slightly. "That's Ethan." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Not exactly." Daniel watched as Ethan approached, his boots crunching against the dirt. There was something in his posture, something tense, almost hostile. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his gaze flicking from Jacob to Daniel. "Heard you got company," he said, his voice cool. Jacob folded his arms. "What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan smirked. "Just checking in, making sure you're still managing." His eyes landed on Daniel. "And who's this?" Daniel straightened. "Daniel Carter." Ethan's smirk faded. "The Daniel Carter." Jacob glanced between them. "You know him." Ethan chuckled. But there was no humor in it. "Oh, I know him all right. The man who buys up land, builds his fancy developments, and pushes out small folks like us." Daniel stiffened. "That's not what I do." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "No? Then why are you here?" The tension in the air thickened. Jacob stayed quiet, watching both men carefully. He had a feeling that whatever happened next would decide everything. Daniel met Ethan's gaze, his mind racing. He had come here by accident, but now it felt like fate had brought him here for a reason. But what that reason was, he still wasn't sure. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter didn't have all the answers. Ethan's stare didn't waver, and for the first time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, doubt. He had built his entire career on confidence, on knowing exactly how to handle any situation. But this was different. He wasn't in a boardroom, negotiating deals. He was on Jacob's land, standing before a man who saw him as the enemy. Jacob let out a slow breath. "Ethan, whatever you think he's here for, you might be wrong." Ethan scoffed. "People like him don't just end up in places like this. They show up when they want something." He turned to Daniel. "So what is it? You buying up land, planning to turn this place into another shopping center?" Daniel clenched his jaw. He had done things in the past, business deals that, in hindsight, had hurt small communities. Maybe Ethan wasn't wrong to assume the worst. "I came here by accident," Daniel said, his voice steady. "And yeah, I'm usually the guy who makes deals and builds things. But this isn't about that." He glanced at Jacob. "I made an offer to help, not to take over." Ethan crossed his arms. "And why should I believe that?" Daniel hesitated. Then, instead of speaking, he did something that surprised even himself. He turned, grabbed the pitchfork Jacob had handed him earlier, and went back to work. Jacob raised an eyebrow, watching in amusement as Daniel started shovelings. "Hey again." Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" "Earning your trust," Daniel said simply. "You don't believe me? Fine, but I'm not going anywhere, not until I prove I'm serious." For a long moment there was silence. Then, without a word, Ethan turned and walked back to his truck. He didn't leave right away. He stood by his door, watching Daniel struggle through the farm work, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he climbed into his truck and drove off. Jacob chuckled. "Well, that was interesting." Daniel exhaled, resting on the pitchfork. "Think he'll come back?" Jacob smirked. "Oh, definitely." The next morning, Ethan was back. But this time he wasn't alone. A few other local farmers stood beside him, their faces filled with skepticism. News traveled fast in small towns, and word had spread that a billionaire businessman was hanging around Jacob's farm. Some had come out of curiosity. Others, like Ethan, came to challenge him. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping forward. "Mornin'." Ethan crossed his arms. "You're still here." Daniel shrugged. "Told you I would be. One of the farmers." An older man with a sun-worn face stepped up. "So, what's your real plan here?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to help, not take over, not change things. Just help." He glanced at Jacob. "This farm, this land, it matters. More than I ever understood before. I want to invest in it. Make sure people like you don't get pushed out by people like me." The farmers exchanged looks. They had been burned before. False promises, bad deals. But Jacob stepped in. "He means it," Jacob said. "I've seen it." Ethan still looked unsure. "You really expect us to believe a billionaire cares about small farms?" Daniel met his gaze. "I didn't before, but I do now." There was a long pause. Then, finally, Ethan sighed. "All right, if you're serious, prove it." Daniel nodded. "Tell me how." Over the next few weeks, Daniel stayed. He worked alongside Jacob, learning the struggles firsthand. He saw the broken irrigation system, the outdated equipment, the debt that loomed over not just Jacob's farm, but many others in the town. And then he did what he did best. He found solutions. Using his connections, he secured funding for better equipment. He partnered with local suppliers to cut costs. He even used his company's resources to help the farmers sell their crops directly to buyers, eliminating the middlemen who had been taking advantage of them for years. Slowly the town started to change, and so did Daniel. For the first time in years, he felt something more than just success. He felt purpose. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Daniel stood beside Jacob, watching the land they had worked on together. "You know," Jacob said, "I don't think you ever planned to stay this long." Daniel chuckled. "I didn't," Jacob smirked. And now, Daniel looked out at the farm, the place that had changed him. "Now, I think I finally understand what real work is." Jacob nodded. "So what happens next?" Daniel exhaled, the cool air filling his lungs. "I think I'll be back." Jacob grinned. "Good, because we're not done putting you to work yet." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. He had come here by accident, but somehow it felt like he had found exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a rush to leave.